Hello, I'm John Bachman.
And I'm Miranda Kahn. Coming up right here on Newsmax Now. Boston strong and getting stronger. A look at the city now 2 years after the bombing. Why today's marathon proves you can't keep Beantown down.
And with the mass murder of Christians, even more Christians at the hands of ISIS, we'll show you the new movement spreading across the world showing solidarity with the color orange. And they say sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt you. Or can they? With SNL focusing so much attention on Hillary, we'll take a look at whether satire can really harm you in these political elections. Some say it was damaging for Sarah Palin. Some say those wounds were self-inflicted.
It's noon on the East Coast, but no matter where you are, it's time for Newsmax Now. And I'm Miranda Kahn. Thanks for staying with us.
And I'm John Bachman. We're going to start this hour in the Mediterranean with what many are calling now a mass humanitarian crisis there with all these migrants. That a boat capsized with hundreds of people on board, and now search crews are looking for those hundreds of folks. That boat flipped off the Libyan coast. Italian ships are in that area, including the UN is there also asking for more help.
Going very, very close to Libya if necessary, and you know, working non-stop day and night. But it is clear that they need help.
One survivor says there were about 1,000 people on that boat trying to get to Europe. The bodies of 24 victims have been recovered so far. Officials fear the death toll may reach into the hundreds, though. For months, refugees have been trying to flee conflict-riddled North African countries where Islamic militants continue to wreak havoc. In Minneapolis, Minnesota today, federal investigators also say they have arrested 6 men who are all charged with conspiring to support the Islamic State. The U.S. attorney handling that case says the men had plans to join and fight ISIS in Syria. All 6 had been conspiring for at least the last 10 months. 4 were arrested in Minneapolis, 2 in San Diego. Prosecutors said all were friends.
And in Australia, 5 teenagers are under arrest for plotting an attack on police officers. 2 18-year-olds face terror charges, the other 3 related charges.
At this stage, we're comfortable that we have this threat fully contained. I think that's an important message. We have this threat fully contained.
Officers arrested all 5 in an operation over the weekend in Melbourne. They believe ISIS inspired the teens. Boston shows its strength again as runners hit the streets for the oldest marathon in the country. This is the second marathon since the deadly attack at the finish line 2 years ago. Security is once again very tight. More than 3,000 officers, both in uniform and undercover, are on patrol. About 30,000 runners are on the course on this very chilly, rainy day.
Well, this time the guy didn't make it all the way inside the White House, but still today a lot of people are wondering how this latest intruder could get as close as he did last night. The Secret Service says in last night's incident at the White House, the person was caught quickly. Still, it's the 6th time in the last year that someone has tried to get over the fence. Last September, of course, that man succeeded and sprinted all the way into the White House while armed with a knife.
National defense takes center stage for several GOP presidential hopefuls at a conference in New Hampshire over the weekend.
Without question, the #1 priority of the federal government is national defense.
The world is a more dangerous and a more tragic place when America is not leading, and America has not led for quite some time.
We need a clear-eyed commander-in-chief who, #1, sets the objective.
And Ted Cruz went on to say the objective is not to degrade ISIS, but to destroy it. But the leading Republican in the race, according to a new CNN poll, is still former Florida Governor Jeb Bush. Cruz and Fiorina are both in the single digits now, along with other possible candidates, including New Jersey Governor Chris Christie and Dr. Ben Carson. For Democrats right now, it's no contest. Hillary Clinton leads with 69%.
More cleanup in the southeast today as strong storms slammed that part of the country. In Alabama, a tornado was spotted yesterday in an area where rail cars were blown right off the tracks. Storms also blew down trees and power lines along the Florida Panhandle and in southwest Georgia. And a big night for country music in Texas. It's unbelievable to see all those folks packing the arena there. Garth Brooks honoring America's military during the Academy of Country Music Awards show last night. He was introduced by the widow of American sniper Chris Kyle. Miranda Lambert won 4 awards, with the top prize of Entertainer of the Year went to Luke Bryan. And we're joined now by JD. And we're joined now by J.D. Hayworth, our entertainer of the year right here
Well,
on
thank you very
Newsmax
much.
TV.
I try to be entertaining and informative, and it's good to be with you here on Newsmax Now.
Great, and we're talking about the intersection of entertainment and politics. Hillary Clinton, again, getting lampooned on Saturday Night Live over the weekend, prompting some, including the Telegraph out of the UK, to question whether it's not the scandal that's going to derail Hillary's campaign, but the satire. Here is that article right here. The more one watches the coverage of Mrs. Clinton, it becomes more apparent that it won't be the scandalous or the serious scandals, the Benghazis or the private email account, but much rather, what that will matter. Rather, the much greater damage could be a joke. Well, we saw Bob Schieffer there. No one's clowning on Bob.
Bob seemed to be silent there,
Yeah.
like crickets.
Well, I think we were trying to play the clip from Saturday Night Live there of this actress who was portraying Hillary Clinton.
Kate McKinnon.
Clay, I'm thinking
You're a
back
big fan.
to Sarah Palin, because sometimes it's not necessarily just the jokes, but when it's paired with the headlines, as we do here on this show, you can see how this can have a longer lasting effect.
Well, remember, in the case of Sarah Palin, it was Tina Fey using the famous line, "I can see Russia from my house." Sarah Palin never said that, but it became attached to Governor Palin, much to the chagrin of the Republican ticket in 2008. It is very interesting to see turnabout here now, to see Kate McKinnon and the cast of SNL taking on Mrs. Clinton. Satire can be dangerous if it overtakes reality. Satire has worked in the past for people who've been successful. We think of the parodies and the impersonations. Baby boomers remember this, although you guys won't. David Fry impersonating Richard Nixon, and an earlier generation remembers Vaughn Meader impersonating Jack Kennedy. But from impersonations to becoming a de facto policy, that's the real risk in terms of satire. And as one who has been easily caricatured over the years, I can tell you it can cut both ways, but you have to manage that and deal with it.
And how do you manage that?
That's the key.
Well, it's very interesting because Glenn Thrush has a piece today in Politico. Quiet, please, Hillary's running. And it has to do with Mrs. Clinton's state of mind. Listen, when you're running for office, Dwight Eisenhower had this to say: a leader is always confident, is always optimistic. Now, things can get you down in a campaign. That's why you retreat to the holding room and grit your teeth and stomp your feet and do all those things out of sight so you can emerge again confident and ready to take on the issues. The challenge is, how does Clinton Inc. roll on? Right now it appears that they're going into their own four corners, not explaining. But the worry is that she might start complaining. It might have an impact on her.
Somebody asked me on Twitter over the weekend, when is Hillary Clinton going to start answering some of these questions, the inane questions we talked about last week with the Marco Rubios? And I said, look for, she might run to Steve Croft, which is what they've done in the past, the Clintons, the famous moment where the light fell, a real humanizing moment for Hillary Clinton on 60 Minutes. I would look to see one of those types of interviews. They have to be more proactive with the press, JD. I think you would agree with that, to avoid this type of parody.
And instead of satire, they do suppers. We already understand she sat down with George Stephanopoulos, who of course worked in the previous Clinton White House, and there are any group of Alphabet Network correspondents and folks at the Washington Post and New York Times very happy to break bread with Hillary, gaze into her eyes and go, yes, we do think you're wonderful and everything will be fine. The problem for Mrs. Clinton is a significant portion of the Democrat Party leans heavily to the left. That's why you're hearing talk now about New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio getting involved in this race. Why? It's because the Democrats have embraced an agenda so far to the left that a whole lot of folks on the left don't want Mrs. Clinton to be left as the eventual nominee. So look for a lot more, but for right now, from the leftist establishment, from the establishment media, it'll be Hillary, you're wonderful, you're great, and from her staff it'll be
those interviews
Mrs.
done,
Clinton. Oh yeah, but they'll be softballs. They will not challenge her, and she is just going to move right on because she's going to have a couple of $1 billion, and we'll see if that carries her to the White House.
And speaking of moving on, thanks so much for joining us. Moving on along later in the show is 2016, the year for medical marijuana.